I am going to rank every single chapter from the original Paper Mario. Let me explain. After so long of people asking me to play the original Paper Mario, I finally did it. Well, my true opinion of the game really doesn't matter right now, but what does matter is my opinion on these chapters. Just like in the Thousand Year Door, Paper Mario 64 is split up into 8 different chapters, not including the prologue. So the simplest ranking to do for this game is just ranking all 8 chapters from worst to best. There really aren't any rules for this list. Obviously, this is my opinion. If you think any chapters are better than ones that I put higher on the list, that is completely fine. I also originally wasn't going to talk about the prologue on this list, but I might as well. And there really isn't going to be any surprise where it ranks. And here it is. The beginning of the game is right at the bottom of the list. Now I know a lot of you guys found this very surprising, but let me explain why this is my least favorite part of the game. Okay, jokes aside, there are some good parts about this chapter. I think that the Goomba village is okay. It's honestly more interesting than a decent amount of villages in this game. While it only has a couple characters there, because it's the prologue, you get to actually hear what they're talking about and what their true personalities are, which I find to be endearing. I also think that the bosses in this chapter are okay. While there is a massive problem with these bosses, which I'll talk about a bit later, I'm just glad to have bosses in general. The Goomba Bros was a very basic fight, but again, I'm glad it's there, and I think that the Goomba King fight was actually kind of interesting. Using the tree to damage the enemies was a good use of the battle setting. The last thing that I want to talk about is Star Summit itself, because you really only experience this place twice. I think that the music here is pretty good, and I think that the place is very atmospheric. It is obviously used better in Chapter 8, but it is at least interesting and probably the most interesting setting in all the prologue. Now, while those are some good points, there are obviously some really massive negatives that are holding the prologue back, and one of those massive things is that you don't have any action commands in battle. The only time you actually get to use them is right after the first Peach segment, and that is for a single battle against a single enemy. The reason why this is so bad is because all the enemy fights and the 2 boss fights feel so much more basic than they could have been. There really is no intrigue in battle, and because of this, you just want to defeat the enemies, get those star points, and just zoom out of this chapter. And that'll be a pretty easy task to do, because the layout of this chapter is also pretty terrible. Obviously this was expected, but it is very boring because of it. There aren't any puzzles, there's no intrigue on the way, and it just makes the experience of going through this chapter very boring. It is almost entirely a straight line, which I think most people would expect would make a chapter more boring. There's also Junior Trooper here, and he's fine. I personally really like him as a character, but obviously as this is your first battle in the entire game, it's not interesting. While obviously this is the worst part of Paper Mario 64, compared to the Thousand Year Doors prologue, I actually think this one is better. And this is mainly because it feels more like there's a structure going on here, compared to the prologue of the Thousand Year Door where it's mainly just tutorials and get to the first chapter. While being better than the Thousand Year Doors prologue can be looked at as an accomplishment, this is easily the worst part of the original Paper Mario, which is why it deserves to be at number 9. I bet some people are gonna say like, oh, give chapter 1 some slack because it's the first chapter in the game. No, this chapter is insanely boring. Everything before the castle is like an add-on to the prologue, but it's less excusable since it isn't the beginning of the game anymore. Just like in the prologue, the layout is literally a straight line, and it only branches off once. One way is to get to Koopa Village, and the other way is to get to Koopa Castle. I think Koopa Village was fine. I mean, it honestly was worse than Goomba Village because those people actually have more personality. But it isn't bad, it's more so just boring and unmemorable. You get your second partner here in Cooper, which is fine, but something I actually do want to point out though is how weird it is that you get 2 partners in this chapter. It kind of makes the partners feel more redundant here, especially because they don't really have specific purposes at this point in the game. Is it a problem? Not really, but it is interesting to think about. Once you get to Koopa Castle itself, the chapter does get a little better. Unlike the rest of the game at this point, the layout isn't just a straight line, which is very much appreciated. Sadly though, because you don't have more than 3 partners, the puzzles here are very weak. If you know what you're doing, or even if you don't, you can kind of just zoom through this place without any thought. Well, I do think that this is fine for a first chapter, especially because a lot of these chapters are more dungeon-based compared to the other Paper Mario games. It does make it feel more boring compared to the other chapters. The last thing I want to talk about is the chapter boss, which is the Koopa Bros, and I actually think they're a pretty good boss fight. Not only is the music here pretty good, but the concept of having to beat 4 of them is kind of interesting, especially because FP is kind of scarce at this point in the game. This chapter is exactly what you would expect a first chapter to be, in all the wrong ways, so because of that, it absolutely deserves to be number 8. Chapter 3 may seem a bit low, but on this list, my opinions on the chapters are very wonky. This is because I've only played the game once, so to an extent, I'm going to like the chapters in this game a lot more than on a replay. So with that knowledge, number 7 through number 2, I think can be interchangeable. Once I play this game again, then my opinion will be more secure. So with that being said, Chapter 3! This chapter is a really good beginning. You start off trying to get through the Forever Forest to get to Boo's mansion. While the puzzles may be confusing for some people, I really like trying to figure out the path to Boo's mansion. It's a cool little game to spot the difference that I found to be pretty enjoyable. I also think that Boo's mansion itself is pretty good. While some people might be turned off by this place since there's no enemy fights, I think it's very interesting that the place is completely filled with puzzles. For the last positive that I want to talk about, we're going to skip basically to the end of the chapter where you try to get the key for the windmill, and then Tubba Blubba wakes up. You have to run away from him in a good chase sequence. Is it stressful? No, but it is fun in my opinion. So now to talk about why this chapter is at number 7, because that was a decent amount of positives for this chapter that I just listed, and all of them are pretty strong positives. So one thing I have to point out is that I have a huge bias against stealth games. I think that waiting around so you can find an opportunity to actually move forward is not fun. I just don't like waiting in video games most of the time. Now I get that the stealth segments in this chapter don't cause a lot of waiting, I know that, but the fact that you get caught by the UFO things to get thrown out of Tubba Blubba's mansion just makes the experience way more annoying than it should be. And speaking of Tubba Blubba's mansion, while I think the layout is completely fine, I think that the place itself is just not memorable. I'm not completely sure why this is, but if I had to guess, it's because of how barren most of the rooms are in this place. I mean, it is truly just a rundown mansion. There really aren't any interesting twists going on here, so it just makes the experience kind of meh throughout. Also, if we're talking about a barren wasteland, we gotta talk about the desert in this chapter. Not only do we have a desert in the previous chapter, this one is just much more boring. And I think that's the vibe that they were trying to go for, but even then, it just makes it not memorable or interesting to me. The layout as well is just a straight line, which just makes it feel extremely pointless and somewhat designed to be forgettable, like I just said. I think the wastelands being unmemorable is less of a problem compared to the mansion being unmemorable, but it is still something to bring up. And the last thing I gotta bring up is the boss in this chapter. It's very easy, which is fine, but it makes it not memorable. There really aren't any interesting twists with Tubba Blubba's heart. It's probably one of the least interesting chapter bosses in this game. I guess I could say the same thing but for Tubba Blubba himself, but I mean, that was kind of designed to be very easy, so we won't count that. I think Chapter 3 has a really good beginning, but after you leave Boo's mansion, it just becomes an unmemorable mess of a chapter, which is why it deserves to be number 7. Out of all the chapters in this game, I probably have the least to say about Chapter 5. This chapter really just doesn't have much going on, which is fine because the stuff that is going on is decent. The best part about this chapter is trying to find the Yoshi kids. I think exploring the jungle was pretty interesting, especially because the layout is all over the place. You do get Sushi here as a partner, which I got a little bit of a bone to pick with Sushi. I don't think Sushi is a bad partner in the overworld, because truly, it's just one of Mario's abilities in the Thousand Year Door. In this chapter though, the puzzles using Sushi feel extremely forced. I don't think this is a good or a bad thing, it's just very noticeable. I could talk about the Raven in this chapter, but I truly just don't care. The stuff that I don't talk about is mainly just fine, which is why I don't have much to say about this chapter. I think the only thing that I have to bring up is the stuff with the volcano. I think that the volcano itself, while the place is pretty massive, it feels very linear in a bad way. The reason I say this is because a lot of this place is just locked out by the hammer upgrade. So once you get that hammer upgrade, you just explore everything else and you're basically done. And you're facing the chapter boss in a very quick amount of time. And the boss itself, just like most of this chapter, is fine enough. It is forgettable, but it's not bad or annoying. I really don't know what else to talk about with this chapter. I guess the Yoshi Village was fine, Colorado was fine as a character. I don't know. A lot of what's going on in this chapter is more so filler, but not in a bad way, because it definitely didn't have a bad time going through it. With all that being said though, this chapter is the definition of mediocrity, so because of that it deserves to be at number 6. I feel like Chapter 2 might be slightly underrated, but to be fair, I don't actually know how people feel about this chapter, so I'm not really that sure, but I like going through this chapter. I feel like this chapter is split into 2 distinct parts, which I'll talk about how I feel about that a bit later. You start off on Mount Rugged where you have to help Parakarry find missing letters. This is a great way to start out the starting area of a chapter. Dare I say, this might actually be the best start to any chapter in this game. Finding the letters in Mount Rugged is just a very simple experience, but because of the non-linear layout, it's just fun to explore. There is an issue with the beginning, but again, I'll talk about that a little bit later. You get to Dry Desert, which is a massive, and I mean massive desert. I will say that exploring this place is a pretty terrible idea because there are really only 3 secrets. One is a useless badge, one is a super block, which is the first one in the game, and the last one is the last place you go to in Chapter 2. Dry Ruins is a very good dungeon in my opinion. This is easily the most dungeon-y dungeon in this game. It's extremely open, you have to find a few things in this place to progress, and unlike in Chapter 5, you don't feel as locked out before you get the hammer upgrade. At the bottom of the dungeon, there is literally a map to show you where to go, because of how easy it is to get lost in this place and to tread water that you've already treaded. Or land in this case, but you get what I'm saying. It's a very complicated dungeon that's very fun to go through. I'll start the negatives though by just saying that the boss in this place sucks. It's extremely easy to exploit, which technically all the bosses in this game are easy to exploit, but on a first playthrough I destroyed this guy. I think I defeated him in like 3 turns, which is kinda sad. But this isn't the biggest problem in this chapter. I finally get to talk about what I've been holding back from talking about. The main problem with this chapter is how segmented it feels. I think it's very easy to remember Dry Ruins, Dry Outpost, and Dry Desert. This makes sense too because you're spending most of your time in this chapter at those places. The issue is that the best times I'm having in the chapter are in Mount Rugged with finding the letters. It's extremely hard to remember Mount Rugged when there's so much focus going on in the actual desert. It truly makes the best part about this chapter pretty unmemorable, which is pretty disappointing. Every single time I think about this chapter, I always think about if it should be lower on this list because honestly, Dry Desert and Dry Outpost are not that good. I know someone may say that's unfair because Mount Rugged is still a part of the chapter, but if this is a true thought that is going through my head constantly, then it's not something I can ignore. At least when I do remember this chapter, I do think about Dry Ruins, which like I said, is pretty good. I think that this chapter is pretty good overall. If they were able to somewhat combine Mount Rugged with Dry Desert, then I think this chapter would make every single place very memorable. It would make it even better, but because it doesn't do that, it has to be at number 5. I feel like I have to be very careful when talking about Chapter 4. People either really like it or really don't, so it's gonna be hard to explain my opinion because to be perfectly honest, just like with Chapter 5, I really don't have much to say about it. This place is a literal toy box which makes the design of this chapter pretty interesting. Compared to the other chapters in this game where it's just an overworld theme that's pretty common, you get this toy world that is very interesting to explore. I also think the layout in this chapter is pretty good. A lot of it is locked behind traversing with the train, and the chapter feels bigger than I really think it is. There's 4 different stations that you have to go through, and there's 1 to 2 pretty long rooms for each portion. Sometimes you fight a boss in one of them, and sometimes you just do some puzzles. You unlock Watt in this chapter, and Watt is an okay partner in the overworld. My only issue is that the ability that Watt has feels very niche, and it's rarely used. Back to the bosses quickly, I really don't have much of an opinion on them. They're fine. Nothing really annoys me about them, and they're kind of forgettable if I'm being honest. There is only one thing that I gotta talk about with the negatives, and it's more so what this chapter lacks. I don't personally have a problem with the chapter itself, but I do think that there was some missed potential here. First off, leading up to chapter 4, Shy Guys are all around Toad Village causing havoc and stealing items from NPCs. I wish that once you rescued an item for one of the NPCs, it would transport you into another part of chapter 4. I mainly think that chapter 4 should have been spread out throughout the entirety of Toad Town instead of just in that one house. It would have made rescuing the items for the people in Toad Town feel like a necessary part of the chapter instead of just an optional side quest. How it is though, I think this is a fine enough chapter. I basically have no negatives for this chapter, but I really wouldn't say I have a ton of positives either, so because of that, I have to put it at number 4. Chapter 8 is the one chapter in this game that I am the least sure about for where I placed it. It's weird because I feel like it's in a way very similar to Chapter 8 in the Thousand Year Door, but I didn't even like that chapter. For how I feel about this chapter right now though, what it does right, it does very right. One complaint I have heard about with this chapter is that it drags. I disagree mostly with this statement, but if there is one place that I would say it does drag, it is the Watt segment. I don't even think the issue about this segment is that it drags. That's a part of it, but I think there is a bigger issue than that. Obviously in this segment, the whole place is dark, so you have to use Watt to get through it, and to see where you go. The issue with this, when you get into a battle, you are forced to use Watt, because if you don't, your partner cannot see and will not be able to move. This makes battling in this section not fun at all. This segment of Bowser's Castle is not fun, and it is easily the worst part about Chapter 8. To be fair though, that is my only negative I have for this chapter. Everything else about this chapter is genuinely fun to me. You start off right back at Star Summit where there is now a village that you get to explore. It's one of the most beautiful places in this game, just like Star Summit, and it's just very interesting to me. And after that, you just travel right up to Bowser's Castle. Before you get to the Watt segment, a lot of this chapter is just using your different partners in different puzzles. I personally really like that every single partner is used. It's like a recap of what you did throughout the entire game, which makes it pretty enjoyable to me. Something that is also very appreciated with this chapter is that there are a ton of Toad ins throughout the entire thing. You will always have the ability to heal up after a battle and get all your star power back, which is very much appreciated for the last chapter. I remember throughout a lot of the endgame chapters that healing up was very difficult to do, so having that feature is just so nice. Once you get out of Bowser's Castle and start exploring Peach's Castle though, it gets very interesting. I always like exploring areas that have been foreshadowed to you before. This includes Castle Black from Super Paper Mario, the Exnaut Fortress from the Thousand Year Door, and somewhat of Origami Castle from Origami King. In this game, as most of you know, after each chapter there is a Peach segment where she explores the castle and does random tasks to help Mario move forward in the game. But now that you're at Peach's Castle, you can now explore anything you want here, and to me, this is just a very interesting experience that I always like doing. And of course, the last thing to mention for this chapter are the bosses, aka the final bosses. I mean, it's the final boss in the game. I don't really know what you guys would expect me to say. I very much enjoy it. It's fun, it's a great way to end the story, and it's a great boss in general. While this chapter may go up or go down as time goes on, right now, I think that this chapter is very enjoyable to go through, and it is a great way to end the game. So because of that, it absolutely deserves number 3. While I don't know how people feel about other chapters in this game, I am almost certain that there is a part of the fanbase that just does not like Chapter 6. You may be wondering why this is, but it's for the same reasons why people don't like Chapter 4 from the Thousand Year Door. Is there backtracking? Absolutely. You have to go back and forth through these different pathways a lot, and I get that people will be annoyed from this. As someone who actually does like Chapter 4 from the Thousand Year Door though, this really doesn't bother me. I don't even think it's that big of a problem in this chapter, at least compared to how it was in the Thousand Year Door. The main reason why it's worse in that game was because you're going through the exact same path every single time. In Chapter 6 for the original Paper Mario though, this is fixed because you're going through different pathways. There are 6 different pathways instead of it just being back and forth like it is in Chapter 4 the Thousand Year Door. And what's in each of the rooms of this chapter are pretty interesting. I like the hedge maze, I like the well, I like the water segment, and the basic rooms in this chapter are pretty solid. While they are pretty linear, I think that's fine because of all the fetch questing you have to do in this chapter. And that's also something I know some people might not like, but I like fetch quests. I don't really know why, but the fact that it didn't bother me here shows that I feel that they are at least tolerable. I also just like the layout of this chapter. There's a central room, which is the first room you get in the chapter with, and then it branches out into the 6 pathways like I mentioned before. I think that's a very memorable layout, and it's probably why this chapter feels extremely memorable compared to a lot of chapters in this game. I also think that the boss in this chapter is pretty dang good. I know a lot of people really struggle with Huff and Puff as a boss, and yes, he is very difficult, but that's also why I absolutely love him. He is an extremely memorable boss from this game because he is not easy to put down. I will say that one problem I do have with this chapter is the way you actually get into it. I don't have a problem with any other chapter from when you beat the previous one and how you get to the next one, but this does not apply to chapter 6. While I think the concept of having a flower gate open up once you find magical seeds is pretty good, the fact that the seeds are spread out throughout a lot of chapters makes it annoying. I personally did not have the magical seed from chapter 2, so going back into that chapter felt like I was wasting a lot of time. I can't even imagine how painful it would have been if someone forgot a magical seed from chapter 3. Luckily the first one is in Toad Town, and the last one is basically given to you in chapter 5, but I still don't think this is the best way to get into the chapter. Everything else about this chapter in my opinion was very fun to go through. While it did admittedly feel a bit short, I think this chapter was a very fun time throughout, which is why it absolutely deserves to be number 2. This is not even close. Chapter 7 is so much better than every single chapter in this game that it's not even funny. Almost every single part of this chapter is really fun to go through. This includes the beginning, which normally wouldn't be that great for most of the chapters in this game. It starts off with this really weird penguin murder. I also like it here more than in chapter 6 of the Thousand Year Door, because this isn't the main concept of the chapter. It's more so just a way to introduce what this chapter will be. And after these segments, you start to deal with some very difficult enemies in the overworld. The enemies now have at least 10 health and can even go up to 15. It is very difficult to take out without wasting a ton of FP. And I think that's one thing that this chapter is really known for. This chapter is pretty difficult. Not only because the boss fight in this chapter, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but also because the enemies in this chapter are just insane to take out. This was somewhat prevalent in chapter 6, but it felt much easier to heal in that chapter. I really like the jump in difficulty that the game brings for these chapters, and it makes it more of an interesting experience when going through them. The only thing that is left to talk about is Crystal King's Palace. The reason I mention this is because this place is my favorite location in all of the original Paper Mario. Is it simple? Yep. It is filled with a single concept. This place is mirrored, so you can do things on both sides. They get a lot of leeway with this concept, and the entire experience throughout is very enjoyable. The puzzles are upgraded, the surprises are upgraded, and overall the entire experience is upgraded. There's also the dupless enemies, which I don't actually know what they're called, but that's what the ghost was called in the Thousand Year Door, so that's what I'm just gonna go with. These enemies bring a sense of surprise and liveliness to a truly dead area. They go into different forms of your partners trying to trick you into picking the wrong one. The first couple times it was difficult to actually try to find the real one, and then the very last time where it wasn't even similar was just really funny. And speaking of this place being kind of dead, the music also adds to that. The music in this chapter, not counting the palace, is pretty good, but then when you count the palace, the music is amazing. The palace music is my favorite track in this entire game. It's extremely eerie and it makes the place much creepier than it really would be. And at the end of this chapter, you get to fight the Crystal King, which in my opinion is one of the hardest boss fights in the entire Mario RPG franchise. He's an extremely enjoyable boss fight and a needed challenge in this game. Compared to all the chapters in this game, Chapter 7 is easily the best chapter and it's not even close. Thanks for watching this video, like and subscribe please.